Welcome to the Adoption and Fostering Journal podcast, and we have some brilliant guests with us today to talk about the topic of allegations. So we'll move on to that in a moment. But to begin with, I'm Vicky Walker, the production editor of the journal, and I'm joined by Dennis Golm, who's the editor-in-chief. So we'll introduce our guests in a moment. Before we do, I just want to sort of remind you that as members of CoramBAAF, you can access the journal as a benefit of your membership for free. The articles we're talking about today are actually open access, so anybody can access them, which is fantastic. And we have a book published by CoramBAAF called Managing Allegations, Concerns and Complaints Against Foster Carers. So that's available from the bookshop. If this is something that, if you're a social worker or you're working in practice, it's a really useful, good practice guide. So moving on to our guest, shall I hand over to you, Dennis, for certain introductions?
Yes, we have two guests from very different places today. So we have Damien Riggs, who joins us from Australia. Damien, you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm here on the unceded lands of the Paramount people, and I acknowledge their sovereignty as First Nations people. I am a professor in social work at Flinders University, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I specialize in working with trans kids.
Fantastic. And what time is it on your end?
Crucially.
6:30 p.m.
We've gone truly international. Shall I mention? So the title of your article is coming out in the July issue of Adoption and Fostering. So volume 49, issue 2. And it's called Allegations of Abuse in Care, the Experiences of South Australian Foster Carers.
And then we have Sarah Thomas joining us from Wales. Sarah, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, morning. I'm Sarah Thomas, as you've said. I'm Chief Executive of the Fostering Network. I'm a social worker and for the last 20 years, I've worked as a practicing social worker with primarily fostering families, children who are looked after, and across a sort of spectrum of all the various roles within fostering. So including supporting foster carers who've been part of the allegations, they've experienced an allegation, have been through that process of it being investigated in the UK, not in Australia, and actually in Wales.
And you have some links to another article that was published on allegations.
Yes, we do a 3-yearly survey called the State of Nations Foster Care, which we invite foster carers and foster services and practitioners to submit their responses to. And the last survey, the most recent one, is 2024, but our 2021 survey, there was significant findings in relation to the allegations data. So we worked with some researchers in Cascade. We provided them with all of the data, and that is a paper that they wrote in response to that in relation to some of the themes and patterns that they uncovered whilst analysing that data.
And the title of that article, I'm doing my production editor bit, is The Worst Day of My Life, Foster Carers' Experiences of Allegations. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's open access as well as Damien's article. So that's from the March 2024 issue. So volume 48, issue 1, I think. Is that right?
That is correct. And what we went to do after that is that we did more work and consultation with the sector and have recently created an allegations best practice and toolkit, so to provide some practical support and solutions to the many issues that were being flagged and raised and brought to our attention.
And just briefly, so the fostering network, you specifically mostly foster carers who are your members, or is it services as well?
Yeah, we have almost 97% of fostering services across the UK in membership with us. So we are both sides of the sector, and foster carer households. We have just over 35,000 foster carer households in membership. We cover England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales.
Fantastic. So a good ally of CoramBAAF, and interesting because something that Dennis and I have been chatting about a little bit is that obviously, Damien, we're thinking the huge size of Australia. Your context is South Australia. There are state by state differences. Even though we're quite small over here, we have our differences between the different nations. And then we're thinking UK versus Australia. So it would be really interesting kind of to have a rich discussion about some of the crossovers and as well as the differences between the systems. But I think there are a lot of similar themes that come out in your articles and your research for how foster carers feel, what the process is like, the impact that it can have on them, and so on and so forth.
So we thought maybe if we start with a little bit of additional context on the maybe allegation process in Australia versus the UK. So maybe Damien, if you could start just to walk us maybe through the allocation process in South Australia.
Yes, because as you said, it's different in every state, and it's called something different in every state. So in South Australia, they're called care concerns. In other states, they've got different names that aren't. To me, maybe I grew up here, so a care concern is a concern about your care provision. Seems quite obvious, but in other states, they have names, and now they're not coming to me off the top of my head that are not as clear. And I do wonder sometimes what that opaqueness means in terms of preparedness for this as a carer. But in South Australia, the process is, so it depends. If an allegation is raised against a carer, there's a number of things that can be done. It could be internally reviewed by the statutory body, and they might decide it's minor or it's vexatious, and they will just inform the carer of the outcome. And that will be not substantiated, or they might have a brief conversation with the carer and say, what's the story here? And the carer will explain what's happened. Oh, okay, that's fine. It's dismissed. That's the end of the story. If it's deemed at the initial sort of pass to be moderate or significant, then there is a process, which is conversations with the carer or carers, conversation with the children involved, conversations with other significant parties. So it could be schools, could be a healthcare provider. It depends who made the allegation. The complex thing, and there's a number of things, we're in flux here in South Australia. So up until I think this week, the legislation was that once the outcome of this was determined, carers had no right of reply. So you couldn't say, actually, that was not done correctly, the investigation wasn't done correctly. You could lodge a complaint, but that didn't result in a review, even a desk review of the determination. Legislation that has been underway for quite some time now, as far as I'm aware, was passed this week. And so that will enable carers to ask for a review of the determination, which has been something that, I don't want to say it's our equivalent of SARA, but in South Australia, we have Connecting Foster and Kinship Carers, which is the peak body for foster and kinship carers in South Australia. And they've been working really hard on that legislation, behind the scenes and in the public and with politicians, because that sort of lack of a response is really destroying to many carers, because the process, and as we sort of outline in our paper, the process is not transparent, it's not judicial, there's no sharing of the testimony that's been collected. Carers have no right of response to that. They can't refute the things because they have no access to whatever's been collected about them. So there's no transparency. I'm not sure if that's going to change in terms of transparency. The bill won't result in that, but it will mean if a carer feels like something wasn't done fairly, they can ask for it to be reviewed.
So looking at you while Damien was talking, this rings familiar, right, with some of the process or part of the process in the UK. Can you walk us through how it's over here?
Yes. So we do have some differences. So obviously fostering and some parts of our care of children is devolved to the other nations, but the primary legislation around this is the Children Act. And the way that it would usually work is that it needs to be, there are clear definitions about what would constitute an allegation, and that is that there is evidence of risk to or significant harm has occurred to a child. So we have a really clear what we call threshold in the UK, whereas we would also then, other things that wouldn't fall under that would be investigated, often terms care standard concerns, sometimes terms complaints and concerns. So there's sort of tiers to it really in the UK. And when we talk about allegations, we talk about those that have met the threshold to be investigated as a safeguarding investigation. So the information that's provided is deemed to be that there is a risk that that child has been harmed or may be harmed by whoever the alleged person is to have done that. So that's maybe a little bit different to Australia. I'm not sure, but there is that really clear definition in legislation for us in the UK.
And absolutely, that's a very clear point of difference now that you've said that, is that in Australia in general, in South Australia specifically, there are what you've just described around people making notifications about the abuse of children. And they are triaged through 3 levels of, and it's really only the ones that are triaged at the highest that get investigated by statutory bodies, except if the allegation is about a foster carer. And then they are all investigated. So if, a teacher rings the line and the crisis line and says, oh, a child didn't come to school with a sandwich today, didn't come to school with any food, and that child was living with their birth parents, unless there was a long-standing pattern of this being reported, that would not get investigated. If it was a foster carer, that would be investigated by default.
And I think there are probably foster carers in the UK who would say that was their experience. It doesn't mean that just because you've got the legislation, but foster carers are, in our safeguarding legislation, are deemed people in positions of trust, which is the same title that is given to teachers, social workers, and some of the work that we've been doing is around, are they all treated the same? So if an allegation is received about the fostering team manager, is the foster carer treated, and is the process the same? And the facts are it is not. There are some very clear differences that need to be addressed, because we know that we can't remove safeguarding. We want to protect children and listen to children, but we should be able to undertake that investigation in a way that provides the protection and respect to everybody involved.
Something, and this probably wasn't on the list of things to talk about, but I'd love to hear about what this looks like in the UK, Sarah, is that in Australia, and again, South Australia specifically, if an allegation is made about the abuse of a child by another child, even if the child who's the victim is in care, it's unlikely to be investigated. Unless it's a very significant thing. It may be then referred to the police. So there's quite this, and I've asked this again and again when I've done my, I don't know, what did you just call it? Safeguarding. So here we call it mandated notification training and working with children training. And in those, I've asked the trainers, okay, but if I know, I gave an example that was about a child of mine at the time who was 16 and a friend of his catfished him. Is that something that should be notified? She said, you could notify it, but we won't look into it because it's a child. And I was like, how interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would come into that. It would be a different approach that would be taken, but I would like to think that anybody referring anything would be investigated thoroughly. Yeah, particularly if it's a child who's looked after, because we're their corporate parents. We should be ensuring that any impact on them and anything that happens, that we take great care of them and that we investigate.
No, I agree.
So can we talk a little bit, Damien, about who took part in your study, the participants? What are kind of demographics and what was the process for engaging with them and what came out of the interviews with them?
That's about 50 questions.
Just deal with those in turn.
So a little bit of backstory. So I've been doing research with foster carers for 20 years. And so in that time, I've done sort of waves of it. So I'll do a bit and then, maybe it's harder to get funding or interest shift. And then I've done another lot and I've done it. So I've done 3 big studies in that time. And I think you build trusted relationships with community. Obviously, we're not interviewing the same people for each study, but the word gets out there. Oh, this person doesn't just come and take our stories and get a promotion. This
Mm.
person does something with our stories that maybe contributes to change in the world. So I think that's part of how, to go back to the beginning, part of, my background in the space, but also how you build those trusted relationships, is it takes time. I remember for the first study that we did, which was 2 decades ago, it was hard to get people that I didn't know, because people were like, who's this kid, coming along wanting us to talk to us about our personal lives. But then with each study, it's become progressively easier for people to get the word out. I think also in 20 years, things have changed a lot with social media.
Yeah.
We didn't know that 20 years ago that we could reach out to carers that way.
Reaching people. Yeah.
Yeah. So then we ended up with it's a little bit of a same old sample in the sense that it's majority cis women, which is what we tend to see of samples of foster carers, which is indicative of the caring population in general in Australia. But we did have, a reasonable number of men. We had a reasonable number of non-binary people, which didn't allow us to do a, specific analysis on the experiences of non-binary people. But I think, we were really focused on making sure we had a diversity of genders. We didn't have a lot of success. We really were trying to recruit First Nations people. We didn't have a lot of success in that space, but we did have success in recruiting quite a few people who had cared for First Nations children, or who had cared for refugee or migrant children. So that was interesting because, again, those can be quite hard populations to reach. I think partly because of the very long histories of forced removals and stolen children in this country, that white people who care for First Nations children often experience a mixture of emotions around that work. And so getting them to speak is quite hard. So it was nice that we could do that. But yeah, I think, there's a degree of homogeneity in the sample, but there's also an interesting degree of diversity in terms of carers who've been caring for a couple of years and carers who've been caring for 20 years and carers who'd had one child and one person who'd had 134 children. I'll never forget that number. So there's an interesting diversity of caring arrangements.
And they were all face-to-face interviews that were
No,
held?
they were mainly done online, just because I think since COVID, we've all shifted to why would you drive somewhere to sit in a stuffy room and talk to us about your personal matters when you can do it from the comfort of your own home? So, yeah.
And maybe before we go into detail on the interviews, because something Sarah noticed when we were chatting before the podcast was around the kind of legal language, or the language used in allegations, and differences maybe between the UK and Australia, and also the difficulties in understanding what different terms mean, because it's a bit of jargony. So maybe could you just tell us what the different terms kind of substantiated, for instance, allegations, and the terms used in Australia mean, and then maybe Sarah, if you could in turn say what they mean in the UK, because we've already learned that there might be a difference in meaning.
So again, I'll go back a tiny step and reiterate that obviously child protection bodies in Australia are made possible through legislation, but then their practices are not legislation. So, you can imagine any act cannot cover every single thing that a social worker does in their daily practice. So it gives, and even the procedures for the acts give very broad guidance. And that's how we've seen lots of things over time. We have very small numbers of formal adoptions in Australia, high numbers of foster care. And over time, there's been a move towards what is called permanent care, which is most of the guardianship is transferred to the foster carers. Not all of it, but most of it. And that's done under what was a quirk in the Act, that the minister could delegate powers to a third party. Now, again, another legislative change that happened a few years ago means that's now formalized in the law, but for a decade it was happening through a sort of loop of the law. So I say that because often carers don't understand that the practices of statutory bodies here in South Australia are interpretations of the law at best, and they are subjective, and they are individuals' takes, and they shift like the moving sands. So I raise all of that to say that these, how investigations are undertaken shifts across years, across decades. What they might have looked like 10 years ago looks nothing what they look like now. And that's because the policy can change as it will. It doesn't need to be reflective of anything about the law other than you can investigate. So an investigation means that the statutory body will collect information to make a determination. They will use the language of natural justice, but it isn't natural justice because the alleged perpetrator does not get to see the evidence. And then a decision is made, and that will be dismissal, nothing there, or substantiation, which means, yes, the allegations have been found to be true. And then the outcomes of that substantiation can be very little. It could be, we're just going to get you to do some training around this topic that we think you might benefit from. We're going to have a few extra visits with you, the social worker, to make sure everything's okay. It could end up that children are temporarily removed while things are sorted out. And at the ultimate end, it can be children are removed and the person is deregistered and can no longer care for children or actually work with children at all. So there's a spectrum of potential outcomes that are part of the determination, but aren't, again, made transparent throughout the process.
Sarah, we have quite specific meanings attached to unsubstantiated, not substantiated, substantiated. It all sounds quite kind of complex. So can you kind of pull those threads apart for us a bit in the UK?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed when I was reading your paper, Damien, is that the terms in Australia is not substantiated, undetermined, or substantiated. So those three outcomes, which I thought was a bit clearer than what we have in the UK, because what often causes a lot of confusion is the word unsubstantiated. And that can be misinterpreted as not substantiated, and it happens quite a lot. So in the guidance that we produced recently, it was very much about setting those out, because in the UK, substantiated means that there's evidence that the allegation has been proven. That doesn't mean that the person can't continue to foster. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that in relation to fostering, that's something we have to think about in relation to your continued ongoing approval as a foster carer. Unsubstantiated in the UK means it's inconclusive. So we don't know. There isn't enough evidence either way. We've worked really hard to try and prove that this didn't happen or prove that it did happen, but we can't gather that evidence, so it's inconclusive. And then we use the term unfounded to say that there was enough evidence to disprove the allegation. I really like not substantiated, because I actually think if we stuck with some clear language, it would be better. And the other term we have in the UK that is currently still used is malicious. But following a serious case review of a child who died, and there were serious failings identified in that case review, the NSPCC over here has really strongly recommended that that term is removed from safeguarding practice, and that is something that is currently being considered in respect of our safeguarding legislation across the UK. So yeah, it's the connotations of that, and how, if that is used repeatedly, how practitioners begin to make assumptions based on that rather than based on the situation at that current time.
It'd be interesting to hear a bit about, Sarah, about what evidence looks like in the UK, because in Australia, it's complex and it can be black and white, but it can be grey. So if it's physical abuse, yes, there's bruises, there's broken bones, etc. That's very clear. But for the greater majority, those are the true minority, the minority of the minority. The majority is neglect or emotional abuse. And so the evidence is hearsay, which in court would not hold up. But in this process in South Australia, it is not treated as hearsay, it's treated as fact.
Yeah, well, we would do a thorough investigation, or I would certainly like to hope that any practitioner involved in this would do a thorough investigation. We have what's called a senior strategy process. So when you're a person in a position of trust, you go through a different process to a family who may have something referred about them. And that process is very, it's full of rigor and or should be if it is done well. And it is very much about, we listen to what the child has said, because we know from other serious case reviews that if we don't, we potentially end up with children being harmed. So we know the importance of listening to children from many histories of the progress of child protection across the world. And often the reason the information isn't shared with the foster care is because that's the best way to do a robust investigation. If you know what the child has said, then you can formulate answers, and so investigation processes require that we don't share that information, we gather information. So the social workers that are tasked with undertaking that investigation should be speaking to everybody they can and doing everything within their power to ascertain what are the facts of this situation. The reality is, it will often be only the foster care and the child that were present when whatever happened, and that is a significant complicating factor. And what we really have to think about as practitioners then is everything else we know about this foster carer. We have to really look at the bigger picture, and that, for me, and the findings that we had, is the thing that is not routinely done. And it is the thing that, we don't often take great care of ensuring that we have investigated and spoken to everybody. And foster carers see teachers every day, they may see health professionals regularly, they might have had the health visitor there that morning, they might have had a visit they could have many children's social workers involved, many support workers and practitioners. How are we ensuring that the investigation is as robust as possible? And do we take the time and effort to do that in the same way that we would for a teacher? Or because what we know is from the incidence of allegations, we lose more foster carers as a result. And there seems to be a view of harsher treatment and differential treatment in comparison to the wider pool of practitioners who fall under people in positions of trust, like social workers, teachers, support workers, and others, residential care workers. So there is something that is not being done well enough, I think, to undertake that thorough investigation. And to ensure that we've listened to everybody, because from the children and young people that we spoke to as part of our consultation process, they didn't want to be moved. They had shared their story and told their truth because they wanted someone to come and have a conversation with them and their foster carer and provide a solution and resolution. Many of these children had been living in this family for years. These were their mum and dad to them. And then they were moved for an investigation to undertake that was sometimes going on for years. And then at the end of it asked, do you want to go back? And they're like, you've put me to live in several different places. I've travelled across the UK and had to change schools, lose my friends, for you to do an investigation. And what we think is that we really need to push that investigation into a more child-focused space, that the child should stay in the foster carers, and we should ensure that we investigate thoroughly, but we listen to what the child was actually expecting the outcome to be from what they shared. And when children can talk, those are far better. We've obviously got a whole other pool, and there is a great number of allegations that happen for the younger pool of children, which we know can come from lots of different sources. It may be from their birth family, it may be from others. And this is where we really have to keep that professional curiosity about the whole situation. And I think we only apply professional curiosity to the foster carer because we hear the word foster carer, and everybody else then kicks into the actions that end up spiraling.
And I think it's interesting what you just said. I wasn't aware of that point of difference, that here the carer is told what the allegation was. What they don't have access to is all of the extra evidence, whatever form that may take, that is collected around them. So they are told, the child said this, please respond to that. And the carer has the opportunity to respond and say, that's not how it happened, or actually this is how it happened, I think they've misunderstood that. And then the statutory body goes off and collects the rest of the information they feel they need to collect to make a determination. But you're right, it's very fraught by the idea that if someone actually is an abuser, it's very fraught by coaching. It's very fraught by preparing a response. It's very fraught by, questioning the child. So, those bits and pieces of it actually don't work in the favor of the best outcomes for the child if abuse actually did occur.
And it's a delicate balance, isn't it, between protecting and transparency, and what needs to be transparent and what shouldn't be, to maintain that protection for everyone involved. That seems like quite a complicated line to toe sometimes, but also one that perhaps with the right approaches doesn't need to be complicated if it's sort of, if there's clear guidelines for how to approach things and kind of remember who needs to be protected and why, but also to respect everybody's rights as far as possible.
I can't wait for Sarah to write a paper on this. I feel like this is what we were hinting at in our discussion, that these processes need to be done differently. And I think Sarah's already got the answer to how they get done differently. So
Yeah, well, we've written a toolkit. It's not exactly a paper, but it's very practical, because one of the other things that we really pick up on when we speak to practitioners is just sometimes a general lack of those practical, like we've done it in a checklist approach, so people can just quickly glance at it and think, you know, have we followed this checklist? Are we doing this? Are we thinking about it in this space? We've done a comparison between the team manager of a fostering service and a foster carer, and what happens from the moment that information is shared and how differently they are treated. You know, just a simple example is that the fostering team manager, they may well be suspended from their role, but they won't lose any pay, and they will carry on as normal in every other respect, because they will be either asked to work from home or not, you know, not attend active work, or they will be supported by occupational health. They may have access to the employment counsellor. They'll have lots of protections and maybe a representation during the meetings, but also a really in-depth understanding of the process. So they're not querying what might happen, because they know this is their bread and butter, this is what they do. Whereas for a foster carer, firstly, they might never have been given enough information about it. So it could be completely terrifying to not know, what is everyone doing? Why am I not in that room? What is happening? Where's the child? They're dealing with the loss of potentially the child being moved. They're dealing with the stress and anxiety of being accused of something that they feel that they haven't done, or, you know, that was different. Their version may be different. They're also not told anything, so they've got very little information. They, for many cases in the UK, they will immediately cease all forms of income. So then they're starting to think about their living conditions, their security of their house, their other children, their family, everything, you know, their potential work role. If they have a work role with children or vulnerable people, there's that as well. So all these things are unfolding, and the experiences of these two individuals who are part of the same team, in my eyes, they are all part of that same team around the child. Huge differences. And I think that's the inequality that we really need to address, because we can never remove the need to safeguard. And that's the critical thing for me, really. And I think it comes down to lots of different aspects around how we prepare, how we normalize asking for support. In so many of the situations, when you review them, this was a foster carer who needed some support and help, but actually felt that there'd be stigma attached to saying this is challenging and things are difficult. We have a duty to ensure that there is no stigma attached to saying this is a really challenging time. And we should ensure that that is something that every foster carer can talk about really openly, but also that they know the A to Z of safeguarding, because allegations do happen. This is a fact. We've got enough data to know on the likelihood of them happening in fostering. And I think we really need to talk more factually about these situations. It can be very different at different services. So one of the things we've recommended is that when you're preparing a foster carer during the assessment process, that you say, in this service last year, we had this many allegations compared to this many foster carers. So the percentage likelihood is this. This is what we do. This is how we'll take you through the process. This is the support you're entitled to. We'll put you in touch with a buddy, a foster carer who knows all about it and has lived experience of allegations. All those things just need to be in place if we are to ensure that we're going to make this better for foster carers and level that playing field in relation to how we treat allegations and the different practitioners and professionals and how all of that differs in the UK.
Because we want to talk about what you found in your paper. And also, just to note, we can share the toolkit with the podcast release, of course. And I think, you know, we're very happy to. And obviously, we will share the 2 articles that we're discussing. Damien, in your study, it said 6 out of 28 participants had substantiated allegations. And one thing I was wondering before we dive into the results is what does that actually mean? Because I assume it meant that it was allegations after which the child was still able to remain with the foster carers, but please correct me if I'm wrong. And I was wondering whether you could provide maybe an example of a substantiated allegation after which the child is still able to remain with the foster carers, just because I think that would be nice to understand.
So maybe that, because I was like, oh, I've got 50 things I want to ask Sarah, but I can't because we're doing a podcast. But maybe this is my way of saying things that Sarah can respond to. So it's complex. And I think there's been a pendulum shift in Australia in the last decade. So there was, I think, a greater move a decade ago to very quick removal of children when there was serious allegations. Not, I didn't have lunch, not that that's not serious, but physical abuse. Very quick. And then, as Sarah said, then children were left in limbo for long periods of time, often resulting in an outcome where the carer was cleared, but by then the relationship has been destroyed. So I think there is some greater hesitation, unless, yes, if a child has a broken arm, multiple bruises, sexual assault, etc., they will be removed. That's necessary, that's obvious. But I think for cases where that is not the case, the child typically will stay with the family. And unless, so particularly around emotional abuse and neglect, unless a long-standing pattern of things that seems impossible to solve and is likely to escalate to other forms of abuse, the outcome will likely be that the child remains in the family throughout the investigation process and post the investigation process. So, you know, a carer could have a serious allegation that is substantiated and the child could still remain in their care. So that's an odd thing about it, is that it's low, moderate, or significant risk. But significant doesn't automatically mean the children will be removed, because significant encapsulates a pattern of not feeding the child, and it encapsulates broken bones, and they require different outcomes. So there's some nuance missing, I think, in that regards, and that's, I think, what carers struggle with. If they're told this is a significant concern, oh well, my children are going to be taken away, but then they're often not, for the better of the child, obviously. So I think there's a lack of, again, transparency around what those tiers actually mean and who determines what the tier is, or what toolkit, like Sarah's, is used to determine what tier it is.
And I feel like we're going to circle back to the kind of, from the discussion of your results, what your suggested kind of resolution to the problem or approach is, and then also with what Sarah just said about the fostering toolkit, which I think will link in nicely with that. Just walking through, or if you could walk us through the themes you found as part of your analysis, because just reading through them, I felt like they seem to reflect emotional reaction to the different phases of the allegation process, kind of starting with the initial reaction to the allegation, then kind of the feelings during the kind of investigation process, and then the feelings maybe more immediately after hearing what has been concluded, or what was the outcome was of that investigation, and then the kind of longer term effects on maybe emotional reactions, longer term emotional reactions, but also changes in behavior. So could you just kind of walk us through the results or the key findings?
That's very kind of you, Dennis, because for our dear people who are viewing us, I was late to this podcast and I didn't remember to read my own paper, and I write a lot of papers. So it's nice to be reminded what we found. It's an interesting paper because it's not how I would normally do a thematic analysis. To me, a thematic analysis, or reflexive thematic analysis following Braun and Clark, would be, these are the distinct ideas that we have developed from the data that have no particular sequence to them. They're relatively, a theme should stand alone, it should be distinct from another one, etc., etc. But when we came to looking at these data, it was quite obvious that certainly we asked people prompts that prompted them through talking through their care concerns experiences, but there was definitely, as we developed the themes, there was a narrative flow, as Dennis so kindly reminded me. So it really was people, and who knows? I wasn't in the investigations. I only got to, engage with the people as they presented themselves to me. But these seemed like people who had been caring for a very long time, who all were doing long-term care, all seemed to love their children very much. And the stories they told were that being told they had a care concern was just pulled the rug underneath them, because they just could never have imagined. They knew all the things, like Sarah said, these things happen and care concerns happen, and we're all told that they can happen. And we do mandated notification training and working with children training, but they thought their parenting was above reproach. So the idea that there could be an allegation at all was just not in their brain. So it was so shocking. And then once the investigation was underway, for those where it was investigated, they felt very much sort of what I've talked about before. So the due process was not very due. It was unclear. They felt like it was going one way and that it would go another way. They also felt that they thought, oh, well, I've told my story. I haven't done anything. This is the misunderstanding, or this is the misapprehension. So this will be done. And then for some of them, it came back substantiated. And that was, how could that process that I witnessed have turned into this?
Mm.
I think the kind of shocking thing for us as researchers was, after that, there was this deafening silence. So for none of the carers were the children removed. Even for ones who were substantiated, for fairly significant things, none of their children were removed. And so they were just told, great, get on with your life. Continue parenting your children. And they're like, but I've just been through a tornado. How do I just act as though nothing's happened? And how do I act as nothing happened in regards to my relationship to the system? But how do I act as though nothing's happened with relationship to my child? And I think that was the sticking point, was a child, for whatever reason, has made an allegation about me. And I still love or have to love them, or find a way to love them. So that was very hard. And then feeling like, that sort of deafening silence didn't really translate into anything other than fear. So, well, it's happened once, it could happen again. And this thing that I did not do was substantiated for some people. Then what's the faith in a system that can substantiate something that the carers believe didn't happen? So, when there's no drastic change to the family circumstances that suddenly introduces some fantastic new dynamic that radically changes their parenting for the better, what was the purpose? And I think that's what many carers were left with, was why? And I'm now really scared. More scared, because I think all carers are scared, but, more scared.
It certainly comes up in the paper that you were involved in, Sarah. The anxiety that some foster carers reported being left with for a very long time afterwards, very long-term effects that the process could have on them. And both papers, hypervigilance, it was something that came up as well, in terms of how they parented, that they're overthinking to some extent. And as you mentioned, Damien, it's no bad thing to think about how you're parenting, but when it goes above and beyond, it becomes detrimental to you.
Well, it's
So I
sort
found
of
that
like
interesting.
competing forces, aren't they? If you're raising children in care, you're almost certainly raising traumatized children who may need very specific parenting practices that are atypical in the general population. But then you have a care concern, whatever the outcome. So you live in fear of that happening again. So you may pull back from some of those parenting practices that were perhaps actually helpful for the child. Very strict boundaries, very clear rules, things that some, are useful for some children. And then what will happen to the placement? Things could get worse. So they're opposing forces.
And it comes down, I suppose, again, doesn't it, to support and being guided on what things to change and what, to continue doing. And yeah, another thing that came up in the Louisa Roberts paper, again, kind of connected to the UK system, was that it was more anxiety inducing and stressful to experience this investigation process and to feel unsupported through it, I guess, which is crucial, than to care for a child with trauma and complex needs. The act of caring, was one thing, but the allegation process was actually the most stressful experience that a foster carer might endure. What does good support look like when it does happen effectively in either system? But I suppose, Sarah, what can it look like?
It looks like everybody who has been supporting before the allegation leaning in and supporting even more. So, one of the unfortunate things that we discovered is that often the supervising social worker, that's what we term the sort of family worker, the social worker that works with the family, thought they had to step away. Misunderstandings around whether their role was such that, because we have to be very cautious about what we say and how we say it to ensure a thorough investigation, that it would be better if they stepped away, which leaves the foster carer completely isolated. But that is not true. That person should lean in. They should be there more. And certainly I've been in that situation. I've been there daily with my foster carer saying, I can't talk to you about what the child said. But social workers manage that day in, day out. We can't talk about lots of things with lots of people because we're there with professional curiosity and confidentiality requirements. That doesn't mean you can't do your active support to that individual. Keep talking them through the process, keep helping them to understand what is happening, why it's happening, why we do what we do. So really giving that wraparound support, and also everybody else in the family, because it can be incredibly difficult. Often people outside of the family home will start saying, you need to stop fostering, or will say, look what this is doing to you. And there could be children there whilst this is happening. So it's a huge period of stress, and you must bring everything you can to the table as a supervising social worker to support that family. In the UK, we also have some legislation that says you should be provided with independent support. It's only actually requirement in England, but it is best practice that's recognised across the UK. But we know from our survey it's only actually given in about 30% of cases. So and where it is given, over 80 to the 90% of people say that was what made the difference. That independent person, sometimes they've been through the allegation experience themselves, but they are there in a peer-to-peer relationship. They really do a different role to that of the practitioners. And I think those things are really critical, that type of support. Going back to the endings, I think one of the things that might be different, so foster carers in the UK often say, you're just left. You get the outcomes. They do get the outcome in writing of that allegation, and those outcomes are there. But our system is different in that your continuing fostering comes under a completely different set of regulations. So the safeguarding piece ends. They have the outcome strategy meeting where all the professionals and practitioners around the table say, this is what we deem the outcome to be from all the evidence we've got on the balance of probability. This is the outcome we are reaching. Then that gets given to the fostering team and the foster carer, and it is for others to think, well, what does that mean for fostering? And that can be the most difficult point, and that's where we find we lose foster carers, because actually, no matter what the outcome, if it hasn't been well managed, if they haven't had a positive experience through it and they haven't been supported, they'll leave fostering anyway. And that can be the most challenging bit. So one of the things we've recommended is that there is a post-outcomes meeting. There's another meeting that all those practitioners who've said it was substantiated or unfounded, if they've come to that position, or often the worst one, the unsubstantiated, we don't know, basically, they all have to support the plans that are made for the foster carer and the fostering service in relation to whether or not they should continue fostering or not. Because to meet the fostering regulations with a background of an unknown allegation, that's a really difficult space, isn't it, to be in? So we're really strongly recommending that there is a post-outcomes meeting where everybody really thinks about what does this mean for the continuation of the fostering for this foster carer, and also resolutions meetings for a child, particularly if they've been moved, resolutions meeting for foster carers, so that people can really unpick the experience, the impact of it, and have support through that, and very emotional process that continues. Because then they have to go through a new an annual review or some form of assessment to go back to the fostering panel to say whether they remain fit to foster. And I think that there's misunderstandings again around some of that, because it can start unpicking the allegation again, and that is not the role of any of that process. It's we've ended the allegation. What we now need to do is, do you still meet the fostering regulations? Do we need to change your approval status? Do we need to think about gaps in learning and development? Do we need to think about how we repair relationships between you and the children or the parent or whoever it is? It's about moving forward, and it must be a solution-focused process.
Love to ask you about, Sarah, is, so I've had this conversation with a number of people lately that we have a process that's not quite as clear as yours, which sounds good, even if it's not always implemented. But is that, so there's an annual, well, they're not annual reviews anymore, they're biannual reviews. So when you'd come up, if you'd had an allegation, and then let's say it was right after your review, so 2 years later, you'd have your next review. And in that review, you would be asked to account for that allegation. And I've spoken, how has that change influenced your, caring role? What have you learned from it? How have you grown from it? What have you done differently? And a number of people I've spoken to have said, there's a problem inherent to that, which is if it's substantiated and the carer fundamentally believes they didn't, how do they account for their actions that they didn't commit? So they have to either say, oh, well, I did it, and this is all the things I've done to become a better parent, or they stick with, I have no remorse because I didn't do those things, so I have changed nothing about my parenting. All I've changed is being more scared of you, which is not going to go well in a review.
And my response to that would be that, back to the equity piece, are we asking teachers and social workers and fostering team managers 2 years later to discuss once again the very traumatic allegation process that they went through 2 years ago? And no, we are not. So let's not apply differential rules and processes to the people who are all considered to be people in positions of trust in exactly the same roles and responsibilities, with a duty to protect children. So that's what I would say to that. And, fostering panels really should only be reviewing the information in front of them. So if that's in the information in front of them, then I can understand why that. But why is it in the information in front of them? Either it was resolved and we have completed that investigation, or it wasn't. And we can't have both.
That's such a good point. I think here it's treated as everything of significance that happened in that 2 years is reviewed. Whether it was, well, it should all have been dealt with. There should be nothing outstanding because any issue should have been dealt with. It's like, no, we need to address, and it goes from relationship breakdowns to child aging out of care concerns. It's a list of big changes.
Yeah,
they're not commensurate.
Yeah, if it is the next review that happens after the allegation, then I suppose that's a tricky space, isn't it? It's been a very long time. Whereas in the UK, we would tend to call an early annual review and do that piece then. But still, it shouldn't be unpicked again in a panel, because if the recommendation going to a fostering panel is continued approval, then that is the recommendation. We have to trust that those practitioners who have investigated and then done the "Are you fit to foster" assessment piece have done their job. That isn't about unpicking it again in panels. I really feel that that's an education piece that is worldwide in relation to where fostering panels exist.
Thanks, sir.
If you could just go back to the process for a second, because one thing that I noticed across both of your articles, like, Damien, your second theme was being treated like a criminal guilty until proven innocent. And then the article Sarah was involved in, there was a sentence saying, when an allegation is made against a foster carer, many report feeling as if they are presumed to be guilty, even when there's little or no evidence. So that kind of guilty until proven innocent theme came through. And I think from the sounds of it, Sarah, what you were suggesting is kind of that the social worker supports people through the process by saying how many allegations have been made, kind of bit normalizing the process, and that allegations happen maybe as well. And I think, I mean, your discussion, you're suggesting kind of a reframing of how, those conversations should be held with between the kind of social services and the foster carers. Can you maybe expand on that and how that relates to what Sarah was suggesting, or what the fostering network maybe?
I think it's, what Sarah is saying that is best practice in the UK is what isn't happening here. So our process is very much determination made, and unless there is, these actions have to be undertaken by the carer, which is part of the outcome of the investigation. That's the end of the story. There's no going back to panels, fitness to care. That's unless, that is not standard practice. And so here in Australia, so it means that I think carers are often left with, so what was the point of this? Sure, there's a tiny number of people that the children are taken away and should be taken away. And there'd also be a tiny number of people where the children are taken away and it turns out they shouldn't have been taken away. But the majority are people who say, so what did this do? Because I'm still registered, I can still have children, I can still keep the children I have. There is no review process as Sarah's describing in the UK. So people are sort of left with not just the fear and the anxiety and all this, the hypervigilance and all these things, it's also, what did that do? Because if it's about safeguarding children, I've often, one carer said to me, they were accused of all these things and the children were still in their care, and they were asked to provide support to the children through the process. And the carer said to me, if that was DV and you asked the perpetrator to provide support to the victim through the process of a police investigation, would that be normal? So it's sort of this really odd situation where you're investigating children's parents, but the parents are the support. The alleged perpetrators are the support system for the child. So that's, Sarah's brought this up before, and I'll bring it up again, like, where are children in this process? They make an initial allegation or they disclose something that's then turned into an allegation by someone who's, mandated notify here in Australia. What did you call them? Safeguarding in the UK. That would be the equivalent. And then the child that's the end of the story. The child doesn't even get an outcome. The child doesn't get told what happened from the investigation. Obviously, if they're removed, they'll be told, but the great majority will not be told what happened with the things they said. And their support remains their parents.
Yeah, children said similar things to us in the UK, that they never really understood what happened. Often they didn't know why they were taken away, because if they hadn't made the allegation, they were just another member of the household. They had no idea. They didn't know anything. Nobody spoke to them afterwards. Everybody said they couldn't answer their questions. Just left with complete confusion over everything that had happened. So we're talking about how that feels as an adult. We also have to think about how that feels as a child, and the impact of what we're doing to the children that we have removed from their parents, placed in fostering environments to keep them safe, and then we move them without telling them why or what has happened. And yeah, it's very, very difficult there. And I can understand why foster carers talk about it as feeling of guilt and innocence, but we're not in the court arena. This isn't
No.
Generally, allegations are not undertaken any police process. There are some, definitely, but those words are the feelings that people feel, and that goes back to how we investigate, isn't it? It's impossible really to not feel that you are being treated as guilty, because you are being asked questions and being put in a position where you have to respond to what might have happened and how it happened, and it's not until you can share all that information that the social workers can make an assessment and investigate. It's really, really difficult. You cannot underestimate the impact of allegations on foster carers.
I think something that you've just, of course, I got myself sidetracked and Sarah's got me back on track again. For Dennis's question was that, I don't remember if we included this extract, but we might have, that part of that guilty until proven innocent thing was, so there's got to be clearly some cases that are referred to the police, clearly. And that becomes outside of the investigation process. Investigation process is basically frozen or terminated because it's, no, this is a police matter now, and it will go through the courts and et cetera, et cetera. But other carers spoke to us about asking, is this going to be referred to the police? Because they didn't understand how any of it worked. A crime's a crime. Why wouldn't it be referred to the police? and being told it probably won't. Not, these are the thresholds that would require us, or these are the allegations that would require us to report to the police. It was conditional language, which again felt like, well, I'm already being treated as, a criminal. That it's not even clear whether or not you're going to see this as a crime or not, rather than a poor parenting decision, for example. So that sort of threat of police involvement, which, as Sarah said before, would lead to inability to work with any child in the future in any sphere of work, has people very scared, which is understandable.
We're having such a good discussion. I feel terrible for cutting us off here, but we're going to have to stop, or we could go on all day, I think. It's such a, really interesting topic. It's been so wonderful to hear from you both, hasn't it, Dennis?
Yes, very interesting. And I think, and also feel like you should exchange email addresses.
Yes, this is a conversation that's just getting going.
Adoption and Fostering Journal.
I feel like this is like editorial policy. You should have said, Jamie, before we accept your paper, you need to talk to Sarah. And there might be some things she really needs to tell you, and maybe she should come on as an author. Like, I'm like, oh, I wish we had Sarah involved.
That's the next paper.
Yeah, we'll do some other things. It would be lovely to talk to you again, Damien. Thank you.
So yes, just a reminder that these are both open access articles that we've been talking about, but members of CoramBAAF can access the journal for free as part of membership. We do have that book, I'm going to mention it again, Managing Allegations, Concerns and Complaints Against Foster Carers, a good practice guide from Laura Williams, available from our bookshop. And of course, to mention the toolkit from the Fostering Network. Is that available now, or is that something?
It is not yet on the website, no. So it will be out in the next couple of weeks, and it is called Allegations in Foster Care Toolkit, the 5 Ps model. So again, lots of things to try and help practitioners just remember that process. So it's a 5 Ps model that we've created.
Fantastic. So yes, we'll sort of link all the resources when we publish the podcast.
Thank you very much for this engaging and interesting discussion.
Thank you so much.